Well, hello there, everyone. Thanks for checking back in with me again today. For this week's Bible study, I thought we would go back to that wonderful Old Testament story of the life of Joseph. This is one of the stories that you can teach even little children and they get it. And the older we get, the more we study it, the more times we go over it. It's so rich and deep in meaning. And as we transition through different times in life, we can learn more lessons from the life of Joseph. So let's take a run through it and see what the message is for us today. In order to appreciate the life of Joseph, you have to understand the background of where he came from. In the book of Genesis, it gives us the history of the tribes of Israel. And we know that Isaac and Rebekah had twins, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob left and went to stay with his uncle Laban. While he was there, he fell in love with Rachel. But Laban tricked him and gave him Leah as his wife instead of Rachel. He switched them overnight, and in the morning when Jacob woke up, it was Leah in the tent. Well, this set up a competition between these sisters, and of course, Rachel could not have any children at this stage, and Leah was producing a baby every year. And therefore, Rachel gave her maid, Bilhah, to Jacob as wife, and then Leah turned around and gave Zilpah as her maid to Jacob. Well, now he has 4 women producing all these children, of which 12 named sons are given to us in Genesis and 1 daughter named Dinah. So these boys all grew up as half-brothers of each other, and I'm sure that at times there was a lot of internal jealousy and things going on. So Joseph is the son of Rachel, which is the wife that Jacob really loved. The Bible makes it very clear that Jacob didn't love Leah, or at least Leah felt that Jacob didn't love her. But we're going to talk today about Joseph, which is son number 11. If you're able to see this chart, you can see Joseph over here is the son of Rachel. Okay? So in Genesis 35:11, God said to Abraham, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply, and a nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you, and to your descendants after you, I give this land. Speaking to Jacob. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. So this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. So these would be the sons of the 2 concubine wives, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So the Bible makes it clear right at the beginning with Joseph. First of all, he's a tattletale. He goes and tells his father a bad report about his brothers, the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah. Now, he's only 17, but at this point, he hasn't learned how to keep things to himself. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age to Rachel, his favorite wife. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. Now, clothes were very highly prized in this time period. And when you study the book of Judges and you find out with Samson that as a wedding gift, the gifts of changes of clothing were actually exchanged as very valuable gifts. So to make this robe, this special robe, and give it to Joseph is a sure sign of favoritism. This is something that's not good to do at all. I know as adults and as parents, showing favoritism between your children is really not a good thing to do, and yet it's been prevalent down through time, starting as all the way far back in the Bible. So Joseph is in possession of this beautiful robe. So when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they had nothing kind to say to him. So it sets up a jealousy there. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more than ever. So Satan loves to incite jealousy among family members. And this is what you see happening here. You see the brothers who hated Joseph anyway. Now he tells them about this dream he has, and they hate him even more. So in this dream, Joseph says, listen to this dream. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly my bundles stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Well, you can imagine what happened with this. They looked at him and said, that ain't going to happen. So they hated him even more. So these bundles that we're talking about were actually bundles of grain that looked like this. And in the dream, they looked like stalks that could bend down in form of worship. So this dream did nothing but infuriate the brothers and make them hate Joseph even more. His brothers said to him, do you think you will be king over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. You know, it's human nature for us not to want to submit to authority. We all struggle, I think, somewhat with this. As wives, we are told to submit to our husband, and as Christians, we, of course, submit to the headship of Christ lovingly. But there are other forms of authority that we don't want to submit to sometimes. Governmental authority comes into it. In school, when, we had to do what the principal said. So all through our lives, this has always been a situation where there's times that maybe we didn't want to submit to authority. So for this young upstart to tell these older brothers that they were going to serve him didn't sit well with them. So then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and even the 11 stars were bowing down to me. Well, now this is getting out of control. So when he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? This is absurd. We're never going to do that. So these dreams maybe were given to Joseph to reveal his destiny, but they also were the cause of intense jealousy and disbelief. The brothers didn't want to believe that, and they didn't believe Joseph that he had these far out dreams. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. It's possible that Jacob had an inkling of what this meant, that perhaps God was giving Joseph a prophetic dream. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel, that's the name that God gave Jacob, Israel, said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. When Joseph went to Shechem, he found that his brothers had moved the flocks to a neighboring area called Dothan. So he went and found them there. But before Joseph arrived, his brothers saw him coming in the distance, and they decided together to kill him. So they hatched this plot. Here comes that dreamer, they said. Come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. So they're talking it over, and they hash this plan between them. Now this is a cistern in the Middle East that we're talking about. It's just a very, very deep hole in the rock area, and this sometimes fills with water. It's a well. It's what we would know as a well. In this particular case, that's what they're talking about, throwing Joseph into this cistern. When Reuben heard this, he tried to reason with them. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben had said this because he intended to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Reuben is one of the older brothers from Leah, born to Leah, Jacob's first wife. So Reuben has at least a little bit of common sense and says, let's not kill him. And it came to pass when Joseph arrived that they stripped Joseph out of his coat, many colors that was on him, and they took him and they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there's no water in it. So this is an empty well, an empty cistern, and they throw Joseph in it. Now you can imagine all of these brothers ganging up on this 17-year-old boy. Would not have been very hard for them to overpower him and throw him into this deep well. And they sat down to eat bread. Throw your brother in a well and then sit down and have lunch? And they saw in the distance a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way down to Egypt. Now, these brothers, they hatched this plan, bloodthirsty lot that they are, to do away with their brother. They throw him in this pit. Then the idea changes, and they see a caravan coming. And that would be something that looked like this. In the Middle East, they would travel in these long caravans of camels, and that's how they would transport goods from one place down to the other. So these Ishmaelite traders are on their way down to Egypt. So they get the idea to give Joseph to them. So Judah, this is another one of Leah's sons, said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And the brothers all agreed with this plan. So they all agreed now, instead of killing Joseph, to sell him off to these traders and have him go who knows where, and whatever danger might happen to this young boy. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. Now, apparently Reuben wasn't with them at that particular time. So sometime later, here comes Reuben. He comes back to try to rescue Joseph. So sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. And when he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief because he realized he's not going to be able to rescue his brother. And Reuben returned to his brothers and said, "The lad's gone. What am I going to do now? How am I going to tell Dad something happened to his son?" And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And then they sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message: "Look at what we found." How convenient. "Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?" Notice their language. They say "your son." They don't say, "Oh, Dad, look what we found we found our brother's coat." No, they say send it to Jacob with a note and says, "Look what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?" And of course, Jacob is going to recognize the coat. And Jacob recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son for many days. All of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." And thus his father wept for him. How heartless could they possibly be? Not only did they do this terrible thing to their brother, look at the anguish that's happening to their father. They've lied to their father, and the father thinks that Joseph is dead, and he's in mourning, and they're standing by comforting him, knowing that they absolutely are the ones that did this. It's unbelievable. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. So luckily, Joseph got sold to an Egyptian official of some standing, because here's why. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. This lesson today, we're going to talk about all the ups and downs that happened in Joseph's life. Up here, down here, up here, down here. And we see that in each one of these periods of time, God is with Joseph. God was with Joseph when he was still at home with his brothers. And God was with Joseph when he was sitting down there in the cistern, probably crying his eyes out. God was with Joseph when he was carried away on the caravan. And God saw that he would be placed in a household where he would prosper. Genesis 39:2 says, Joseph was in Potiphar's household, and so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. So Joseph has been ripped from his family and sold into slavery, and yet God enables Joseph to succeed in this new role. This is a foreign country, a foreign language. He's away from home. He was the favored son, and now he's a slave. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. It stood out to Potiphar, and he said, wow, everything he does prospers, so I'm going to make good use of that. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. So God has prospered Joseph, and now Satan throws a temptation in his way. It's not Satan's liking, let's say, when he sees that God is with his people and prospers them. Thus, Potiphar left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He didn't know what he had except for the bread which he ate. He had complete trust in Joseph. Joseph managed everything in the household for him, bought the supplies, saw to the food, saw to the servants, saw to everything that was involved in the household. And all Potiphar had to do was sit down at the table and eat. Then the Bible says in Genesis 39:6, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. This is the first indication we have that this is a handsome young guy. And after a while, the master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted into my care. So he tries to explain to her that my master has trusted me with everything in his household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. So by asking, how could I do such a wicked thing, he shows that he's aware of what's being offered. He knows what's being offered to him, and he decided against it because he knew, first of all, that it was morally wrong and that it would be a sin against God if he took her up on her offer. He's not stupid. He knows that she's propositioning him, and he knows what that means. Now, also another time in the Bible, we see another man, this time the man doing the tempting of Bathsheba. In the story of David and Bathsheba, David took Bathsheba and slept with her, but when the sin was discovered, he said, King David admitted that also his sin in taking Bathsheba was a sin against God. When Nathan confronted David and said, you are the man, David realized then that he had sinned against God, and he wrote in Psalm 51:4, against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. See, sin, by definition, is not wronging another person. It's rebelling against God's law and glory. If Joseph had taken Potiphar's wife up on her offer, he would be sinning against God by sinning against God's law, his moral law, and against God's glory. So Joseph decides, no, I'm not going to do this. So she's watching him day after day after day as he goes about his job, performing his duty. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. So Satan is throwing sexual temptation at Joseph pretty hard at this point, trying to bring him down. One day, however, no one else was around when he went to do his work, and she came and she grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she's angry, because this is a woman scorned now who has wanted to try to entice this man who won't do it. So she's angry now. So she calls out to her servants, and soon all the men came running. Look, she said, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. So now he's not the handsome man working in her house that she desires, this man that's in charge. Now she relegates him back down to being a Hebrew slave. My husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. So she's tried flattery. Then she sets up a daily siege to wear him down. So even when presented with the opportunity, he had the opportunity there, Joseph did not give in to the temptation, and he did it out of respect for God and for his master Potiphar. When he heard me scream, she goes on to say, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me. So she kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him the story. That Hebrew slave you brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me, she said. But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me. Well, of course, Potiphar believes her, and he's furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Remember, Potiphar is the head of the guard of the prison. But here again, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So now Joseph goes from head of Potiphar's household to a slave back. Now he's thrown in prison, but God is with Joseph and he prospers him even in prison. He gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So during this period of time that Joseph is in prison, he has some lessons he has to learn. And there are times in our life when we're in these down times, these valleys of life, that there are lessons usually that are learned during this period of time. First of all, Joseph learned that life is not always fair. What happened to him with Potiphar wasn't fair. We live in a broken world where injustice often happens. Joseph was a victim of a cruel world, and he had every right to be bitter. And Joseph's life teaches us how to demonstrate godly character in spite of the difficulties. When you read through the story of what happened in prison, we find that Joseph is left down there to languish for 2 years. 2 years he stayed in prison. And you say, why, God? Why would you keep him in prison for 2 years? He didn't do anything wrong. But during that period of time, Joseph had some lessons to learn. He had to learn patience. He had to learn to trust God, that God would still rescue him from prison. He had to learn how to temper himself and how to present himself rather than the rash 17-year-old who blurted out all of his highfalutin dreams. He had to learn now how to get along a little bit differently. So during these 2 years of waiting, Joseph clung to the promises that God had given him. He believed God's promise. He didn't know how God was going to accomplish it and when it would happen, but he knew that God was faithful. And during this time, 2 people down in the prison had dreams also, the butcher and the baker. And Joseph was able to interpret the dreams. And the only thing he asked for that was, remember me, when you're released from prison. And that didn't happen. So he had more waiting. He was actually used in this situation to interpret the dream, but then left to languish in prison. When you study the life of Joseph, you see parallels to the life of Jesus. One complete Bible lesson that we could do would be to look at the parallels between Joseph's life and Jesus' life. First of all, in Joseph's life, claims were made about him. He made claims about who he was, and people hated him. He told them about the dreams, and people hated him. Jesus told people who he was, and they hated him for it. Joseph suffered because other people hated him. Jesus suffered because people hated him. Joseph offered love and forgiveness finally to his brothers. That's what Jesus offered, love and forgiveness to everyone that would accept him. Joseph provided for his family, redemption, forgiveness. We'll study all of that next week. Jesus offered a great place to live in heaven. Joseph offered them a place of haven in Egypt. Joseph took care of the family's physical needs. Jesus takes care of our needs. Joseph suffered evil that God meant for good, and we're going to talk more about that next week. Jesus suffered evil and that God meant for good. But what other parallels do we see at this point in the story? Joseph was betrayed by one close to him, his brothers. Those evil boys threw him in the pit and sold him off to slavery. Joseph was tempted, but he didn't sin. Neither did Jesus. Joseph was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, just like Jesus was falsely accused. Joseph wasn't was found guilty without even a trial and thrown in prison, just like Jesus was found guilty with no trial. So, what are the upheavals, though, that you see in this story that happened to Joseph in his life? The first thing is he was abruptly taken from his family. That morning when he woke up, he did not know that that afternoon that he would be finding himself in the bottom of a well, and then later in the evening sold off to slavers who would be carting him miles away from his family, never to see his mother again, never to see his father again or his brothers. He was taken to a strange place. He didn't know the language. He didn't know what to do. He was a slave. Luckily, he was placed in a given to someone who had at least some means to provide for him. He was placed in a slave position. He went from being a favored son to a slave position. He faced dangerous sexual temptation. Was he ready for that at his age? How old was he? 20, 21, 22? Still a young man. And he faced what we would know today as sexual harassment. He was unjustly accused and thrown in prison. So all these things could have disillusioned Joseph at this point. But God was with Joseph. Just like God is with us when we go through these terrible times in our life, when life throws us a curveball. We wake up in the morning and maybe we had this happen to us in our lifetime. We get up, we go to work. We don't know that that day we're going to be laid off. We get up that day. We don't know that maybe that afternoon a tragedy would happen and someone that we loved would be killed. I had someone that I loved killed in a car accident that I heard about it while I was at work. These things happen in life and you don't know, they throw you a curve. That's what we see with Joseph. Joseph went from being a favored son, sheltered perhaps, even babied a little bit by Jacob, to betrayed and living in slavery. Then he rises back up in Potiphar's household. Then he's back down in the dungeon again. And then we see that he's finally released from prison and goes on to become the second in command in Egypt. And we'll see that part of the story next week. But the theme that runs through Joseph's life is God was with him, not only in the good times. God is with us when things are going well and financially we're stable, but God is also with us when things aren't going well. Joseph goes on to say at the end of his story, what the brothers meant for harm for him, God meant it for good. And the verse in the New Testament that addresses that is one of my favorite and many people's favorite, Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good to them that love God. That means the bad things too. When bad things happen to us, there is good that can come out of that. God uses those bad things to teach us things about ourselves, things about others, and things about him. And all of these things, when mixed in God's hands, he produces good out of no matter what the bad thing was. Think about that. Read it again. And we know that all things, good and bad, work together. God makes them work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called. And this is done according to his purpose. Sometimes these bad things come into our life purposely. Other times they're not purposely. But either way, God uses all that happened to us for our good. Okay? So think about that this week as you recall these little things about Joseph and some of the things that happened to him. And next week we'll go on and see what happens at the end of Joseph's life and why these things had to be as they were. Okay? So let's close in a moment of prayer for this week. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for these Bible lessons that we can learn, these especially lessons from the Old Testament. We could see your hand of protection around Joseph every step of the way. And we know that it must have been a hard road for him to go from a favored son to a slave and then languish in prison for years. And he might have thought, but Lord, you showed me those dreams. You said that the stalks of grain would bow down to me. You said the sun and the moon and the stars would bow down to me. What happened to that dream, oh God? And I'm sure, Lord, in those quiet moments that you upheld him and comforted him, and eventually you brought everything to pass when the time was right. Help us to learn from these lessons this week, Lord, and to trust you even more. If this is a bad period of time for you, for us, then I just pray, Lord, that you will be with each and every one listening here today. If you're in one of those periods of time when things are not good, remember that God is still with you through each of these things, that he has prospered you in the past, and he will uphold you even in this time. And we ask all of these things, Lord, in your precious name. Amen. Okay, friends, that's it for this week, and join in with me next week, and we'll continue the wonderful lesson of Joseph. Okay? Bye for now.